There's something about the crunch of leaves under my boots that reminds me of death. Walking down an unlit path to get back to my house, I'm regaled with that feeling with every passing step as I travel through the park, a shortcut between my home and a friend's Halloween party. This is the first in a long time that I've taken this route because I don't usually mind the extra time walking, and you never know who you can bump into in the woods. I see a lamppost up ahead, providing a dim light of oasis in an otherwise desert of darkness. My footsteps become more frequent against the pavement and the crunch of the leaves. I pass under the lamppost and feel the temporary serenity of protection from the light around me. It's tempting to stop and bask in it, but this will only delay the long walk home to get to my secure location. I hear faint crunches in the dark behind me, and I subtly turn my head without bringing too much attention to the fact that I'm skittish. I'm not easily spooked, but that doesn't mean I don't have the common sense reaction of feeling vulnerable when walking alone at night on a path surrounded by trees. Nothing but the darkness and the faint silhouette of the oak trees all around me. It's a full moon tonight, but that does little good against the thick canopy of the park I, for some inexplicable reason, have decided to jaunt through on this October night. My pace quickens again after I pass through the halo of light, and after 100 feet I look back at the glowing light to see if there is another traveler behind me or if it's just the autumn night playing tricks on me. Again, nothing. Relieved, my feet return to my normal pace and my mind is soothed. Another crunch. I jerk my head back, unable to play it cool as I had before, and again see nothing. My heart is racing, and my steps begin to match it. There's another lamppost a few hundred feet in front of me, which temporarily reduces my anxiety. As I pass under it, my feeling of oasis has transitioned to a fear of being under a spotlight for all the darkness to see, with the light blinding me to all that the woods have to offer. A shiver runs up my spine and settles on top of my head. I look back at the light after passing another 100 feet, and I see it. A shadow darts across the halo of light as quickly as an ember flying away from a bonfire. Questions arise in my head. Did I really see that, or am I just letting the season get the best of me? Regardless, I begin to think about how fast I can get home without going into a full sprint. My hands instinctively go into my coat pockets and my legs move as fast as they can while always having one foot on the ground. One less bend before I get to the clearing and can escape to my modest home that now seems like a fortress I desperately need to be safe. I see the streetlights through the trees and I know that home is just within reach. But I'm almost paralyzed by the approaching sound of crunching behind me. The steps are quicker than mine and close enough so that I can hear them even if they don't step on the dead leaves on the path. I get through the woods and onto the street, and without thinking my walk turns into a run as I go up my sidewalk, up my steps, fumbling with my keys as I open my front door and quickly shut it behind me and slide the deadbolt into the lock position. True oasis. I put my back against the closed door and exhale. But before I can draw another breath, I turn around and look out the spy hole. It wasn't tricks, and it wasn't the season. A shadow in the shape of a person steps out of the woods and is sauntering towards my sidewalk. Maybe it was someone who left the party just after me and lives near me, I tell myself, knowing it's a comforting lie. Maybe it's someone who was lost in the woods without a light and just followed someone who looked like they knew where they were going, telling myself another lie. I watch with horror as the shadow stops briefly in front of my house and begins to walk even more slowly up my sidewalk, following the steps I had taken not 30 seconds earlier. I hold my breath, fearing that the shadow can hear me on the other side of the door, and I can hear my heart pounding on the inside of my chest. As the shadow walks up the steps, it pauses at the top. The locked door dividing us now feels as thin as paper, and I weigh the consequences of sliding my couch in front of the door as a reinforcement versus the idea of creating that much noise. I remain still and keep my eye fixed on the spy hole. It seems paralysis made the decision for me. The shadow takes 3 steps closer to my front door, and it no longer remains a shadow, but what I see makes me desperately wish it maintained the mystery the shadow provides. As it comes into the dull glow of the full moon, I can see its eyes, or rather lack thereof. Where its eyes are is just smooth, pale skin, as though the eyelids had fused together. As I scan down the flat nose and thin lips of the shadow's face, I see protruding downwards from its mouth are two white points, teeth. Two abnormally long canines protruding from what is otherwise a demonic-looking shadow on my front steps. My heart stops, and I can feel a burst of air come from my mouth. A fucking vampire, I say to myself. This is just a sick joke from someone at the party. Again, lies, I tell myself. I want to run away, but my eye is magnetized to the spy hole. As I see the shadow inquisitively look around my porch, I glance at the end of my sidewalk. I look past it at first, but as my eyes focus, I see a second shadow standing there and begin to slowly walk up the sidewalk. My body repulses internally, but my head doesn't move and my eye stays fixed on the shadows. At the top of the steps, the second shadow says in a low mumble in there, "Yes, not 2 minutes ago," replied my stalker in the woods. "Good, this shouldn't be too hard at all." "Nice work," replied the newcomer who seemed to be in charge. I'm finally able to turn around and my head is swimming. My first thought is the only one I can manage as I try to formulate a plan. Do I have a crucifix? What do I have that can be fashioned as a stake? What can I say? I'm a product of the horror movies and scary stories I grew up on, never expecting that it would ever teach something useful. I run to my bedroom and open a trunk at the foot of my bed. Digging through some knickknacks, I find it, a crucifix that had been used at my grandma's funeral that my parents gave to me, hoping it would spark some sort of new engagement with the church I had lost interest in many years ago. I break off a leg of a chair at my kitchen table, and while it doesn't look like they do in the movies, I fashion a wood stake that will certainly be good enough for my purposes. Returning to my front door, I steal one last look out of the spy hole and see one shadowy figure still on my porch. Where the other one went, I couldn't say, but I'll take it as a good sign and feel some relief. I muster as much of my courage as the situation allows, and I slowly slide the deadbolt until the door is unlocked. Even more slowly, I turn the handle until there is nothing between me and the shadow except the door loose on its hinges. I count to 3 in my head and fling the door open. With my right hand, I wildly swing the chair leg in a downward motion, while my left holds the crucifix exactly how I've seen it done at all the movies. After 3 swings of the stake, hitting nothing but air, I realize there's nothing on my front porch. Adrenaline coursing through my veins, I step forward to the top of the stars, clutching the crucifix so hard I can feel it puncturing my skin. Nothing. Breath escapes me, but I can't breathe in. I turn around and calmly walk back inside and close my door. Resting my back against my front door, I remember how to breathe. With my mind racing, I return to the spy hole. I can wait here all night, I say out loud, knowing that I almost certainly won't. Seconds crawl by, but they feel like hours as I finally start to relax. I slide the deadbolt back into the locked position and start to feel sane again. The deadbolt clicks in the locked position, and the tension is leaving my body. As I begin to remove my eye from the spy hole, I feel 2 long teeth sink into my neck just below my ear. It was Halloween night. My parents had just left with my little brother to go to a party at the middle school. I didn't go because I was in the 11th grade and just spent the day drowning from essays and tests, so I wasn't in the mood to spend my night watching kids scream in terror from people in rubber masks and styrofoam skeletons. Once they left, I hopped on the couch and scrolled through the horror channels. I eventually found a movie that seemed interesting, The Not So Good Dead, directed by Sam Amy. I put the bright orange candy bowl on the porch and started to watch the movie, but I couldn't focus. I was too worried about my family. Halloween was never my favorite holiday. Even trick or treating never piqued my interest, not even as a kid. Especially with all the disappearances happening in the city. The Halloween before, 5 teenagers and an entire family went missing. 2 weeks later, the police found the body of a missing teenager, if you can even call it a body. They were missing their head, and they were missing their intestine. The police say it was most likely an animal, like a bear or wolf that came down from the mountains and caught them on their way home. The other teenagers and the missing family have still not been found to this day, but the loved ones of the missing have accepted that they are gone and they're never coming back. As I was stuck in my train of thought, the grandfather clock my dad kept struck 9. I didn't think much of it until I realized that my family should have been back hours ago, and my mind started to assume the worst had happened. I sprung up from the couch and raced to my cell phone, but before I could reach it, I heard a knock on the front door. No kids should have been out at that time, so why was someone knocking on the door? If it was my dad or mom, they have a house key so they wouldn't need to knock. It must have been some kids ding-dong ditching houses. That was my thought until there was a second set of knocks. I ignored all of my instincts and decided to call my dad, with the dial of the first 3 numbers there. It was a loud bang on the door. I continued to dial until loud, rapid banging started to hit the door. I frantically dialed the rest of the numbers. I pressed call, and what I heard made my blood run cold. I held the phone to my ear. No service. As I removed the phone from my ear, I noticed that the banging had stopped. I turned to look at the door and froze. Looking at me from the mail slot of the front door was a glassy, white eye. When our eyes locked, the mail slot closed, making a loud clank noise that echoed through the house. I then heard footsteps walk away from the door into the distance, but I could still feel its ominous presence. I thought it was over. Then the power to the house was cut off. My reaction was to kneel and keep quiet. What was probably just seconds felt like hours in the darkness of the empty house. When I got a hold of my nerves, I slowly and scarcely stood up. I then collected all of the strength I had left and said to you, "Who's there?" When I finished the question, footsteps rushed to the door, and they started banging, kicking, and even scratching at the door. Whatever it wasn't going to stop until it got to me. That was clear. I started to take a step back. Then it let out a loud screeching noise that was a mix of a bat and a deer. No human being could make a noise as terrifying as that. The door started to crack and bend from the force of the creature. I didn't know what to do, but I didn't have time to decide. The door broke off the hinges, falling to the ground, making a loud sound of wood hitting tile. I ran into the kitchen to arm myself. I grabbed a knife from the drying rack, and I turned around to see what had broken down the front door. Nothing. There was nothing there. Just the broken door, but that wasn't the part that scared me. What scared me was past the door. There was nothing. No light to houses. Not even the street. It was just a thick fog that swallowed my home. There was then a sound from above my head. A scraping sound. Claws ripping up the drywall of the ceiling. I didn't need to look up because the creature dropped in front of me. It wasn't human. Its flesh was falling off the bone. Its arms were so long they were touching the floor, and a horrid smell of roadkill filled my nose. As I struggled not to vomit at the sight, I noticed it wasn't looking at me. It was facing up and looking at the freshly made claw marks in the ceiling and smiling with genuine joy. It then made a sound that still haunts my soul to this day. It was a whining sound, almost like an animal, but at the same time, not even close. I tried to take a step back, but with the creak of the floorboard, the creature snapped its neck downwards to look at me. I was so caught off guard that I fell back. When I hit the ground, the noise stopped and I looked up. Now I could see its face. Its skull was wrapped in rotting flesh and dark veins. I vomited from the mixture of sight and smell. The creature then let out a cackle, almost like a hyena, as if it found enjoyment from seeing me in that state. Once I was done being sick, I dashed the stairs, but before I could make it to the first step, the creature, with what felt like a truck, slapped me with the back of its skinny and rotted hand. I was sent flying to the other side of the kitchen. With no doubt, I knew my arm was broken. I looked to my right and saw the knife, with the creature slowly walking up to me. I grabbed the knife with my non-broken arm. I pointed the knife towards the creature, ready for the end. I closed my eyes, accepting my fate, counting my last breaths. I hear the creature smelling the air. Whatever scent the creature caught was making it salivate. The creature then looked towards the cabinet and rushed it with animalistic movements. With both hands, the creature ripped the cabinet door off its hinges. Cereals and snacks fly across the kitchen. The creature then pulls out an old bag of candy corn that no one ate. It then starts walking towards the broken front door. Before the creature makes it to the door, it stops. It looks at the puddle of vomit on the floor and starts playing with it. It then picks up a piece of chocolate from the puddle, looks at it, and says in my own but demonic voice, "Bad candy," and then rushes out the door into the fog. The moment that the creature left, the entire house shook. I stumbled to look out the window and see that the fog had dissipated. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. While I was fighting to stay awake, I heard the shattering of a window. It was my newly widowed neighbor. I could hear his screams, and him begging for his life. I then heard the slashing and ripping of flesh, along with screams of agony. I then blacked out from exhaustion. I was then woken up by the frantic calling of my dad. "Are you okay?" I couldn't see well, but I could make out the tears in my dad's eyes and the silhouette of my mom and brother crying. I then woke up in the hospital with a cast and bandages on my ribs. I still had the screams of my neighbor ringing in my ears. The police ended up asking my family questions. My family chalked it up to a robbery gone wrong. I also said it was a robbery because no one was going to believe me anyway, but I know what happened that night. Afterward, everything seemed to be back to normal, but I was still having nightmares every week. I eventually told them about that night, but they just told me that I was watching too many scary movies. A couple of weeks later, they found my neighbor's body. It was like the missing teenagers, but this time in place of his intestines was candy corn. A new family moved into his house a month later. Hopefully they won't have to experience the horror I did on Halloween. I wish I could have done more to help him. The sound of the doorbell echoed through my empty house like a banshee's wail. It was Halloween night, and I was alone. Not by choice, but because it was my ex's turn to take our kids, Lily and Ben, trick or treating. The custody agreement was part of the divorce proceedings. Though I found it hard, I was getting used to the echoing silence of our once lively home. When the doorbell rang, I was hoping to see Lily and Ben at the door, their faces lit up with joy and their bags heavy with candy. Instead, I found an empty porch. Puzzled, I closed the door, thinking it was some kids playing a prank. The doorbell rang again. Rushing to answer it, expecting to see my children, I found nothing. Just the chilling October wind that seemed to whisper their names. This repeated throughout the night, the doorbell ringing, and each time, there was no one there. By midnight, I was frustrated, frightened, and worried about my children. Their mother hadn't called, and they hadn't come by like they were supposed to. The worry nibbled at my sanity, and every ring of the doorbell twisted the knife of dread in my gut. The next day, the town was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The local news reported multiple cases of missing children from the night before. My heart skipped several beats as the newscaster read the names of the missing. But to my relief, Lily and Ben weren't among them. Still, the relief was fleeting. I tried calling my ex and the kids, but was met with voicemail each time. Panic gnawed at my insides, leaving me a hollow husk of a man. I decided to drive over to my ex's place, desperate to know where our children were. When I arrived, the house was eerily silent. There were no sounds of laughter, no television noise, no signs of life. The windows were dark, the front lawn strewn with Halloween decorations. I banged on the door, praying for an answer, but none came. I called out for my children, but my voice was swallowed up by the ominous silence. A chilling realization started to creep up on me. Something was terribly wrong. I broke down the door, and what I found inside froze the blood in my veins. The house was empty, eerily quiet, and there was a coldness to it that seemed to seep into my bones. My ex was nowhere to be found. The kids' rooms were untouched, their beds unslept in. It was as if they'd disappeared into thin air. Suddenly, I remembered the doorbell, the incessant ringing from the night before. A feeling of dread settled over me. Were my kids trying to reach me? Why couldn't I see them? Why were they now missing? The questions swirled in my head, intertwining with the fear and the crippling uncertainty. The silence of the house echoed the silence in my life without my children, and it was the most horrific thing I'd ever experienced. With trembling hands, I dialed the police, reporting my children and their mother missing. As I sat in the empty house, the dim light from the setting sun casting long, menacing shadows, the doorbell rang again, but this time I was terrified to answer. My life had taken a horrifying turn. The doorbell, once a symbol of my children's happiness and innocence, had now turned into a monstrous, chilling sound that echoed the emptiness and terror of my life. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Lily, Ben, or their mother. The police were at a loss. They'd searched the house, the surrounding areas, spoken to neighbors, but all leads hit a dead end. Every night, I returned to my empty home, the silence deafening, the doorbell haunting me. The sound echoed in my dreams, morphing into a nightmarish symphony that jolted me awake in the early hours of the morning, drenched in cold sweat and shivering with fear. The townsfolk began whispering, pointing fingers. The words suspect and guilty started floating around. I was becoming a pariah in my own town. The missing children had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, and my own loss made me a prime target for their angst. But the real horror was inside me. The fear of not knowing where my children were was eating me alive, turning me into a hollow shell. Every knock, every made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest as if ready to burst. One night, while sitting in the dark, staring at old photos of Lily and Ben, the doorbell rang. It was late, well past midnight, and the sheer unexpectedness of the sound sent shivers down my spine. I approached the door, the dread heavy in my stomach. As I reached out for the doorknob, I felt an inexplicable chill. I opened the door, expecting the usual emptiness, but instead I found a small plastic bag on the doorstep. Inside the bag were two things: a small, worn-out teddy bear that belonged to Lily, and a superhero mask that was Ben's favorite. Seeing their precious belongings, my heart sank. Tears stung my eyes as I clutched the items close, feeling a part of my soul shatter. The silence of the night seemed to mock my despair. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was living a parent's worst nightmare. The doorbell continued to ring intermittently throughout the night. Each ring was like a punch in the gut, a cruel reminder of my loss. I didn't know who or what was causing it, but the sound had become the soundtrack to my horror-filled existence.